You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Let's go to him. Yeah, let's go to him. 39C, 39C.
Hi guys, Teresa Tang here. Something a little different this week. Maybe you can hear it. I'm not in our usual podcast studio. I'm actually at the Shangri-La Hotel in the heart of Singapore.
We heard from the Defense Ministry spokesperson straight after those talks ended.
Have you heard of the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue? If not, here's the gist of it. It's billed as Asia's premier defense summit. Leaders from around the world, they meet, they talk face to face, and they share ideas on how to tackle security challenges in this region and beyond. Translation, a lot of big names discussing a lot of big issues. I'm taking you behind the scenes and checking in with our CNA correspondents here covering the summit. Leong, Olivia, Siong, and Su. Let's go.
Perfect timing.
A lot of analysts have said that the value of a summit like this is the opportunity for face-to-face interactions. I'm on the mezzanine level of the hotel, and I have a bird's eye view of the venue. I'm looking down on the lobby lounge. It's like a restaurant. It's an open, airy space, and I can see men and women in uniform huddled over a coffee or a plate of food. They're deep in conversation. And it's been fascinating to observe some of the delegate interactions, both inside and outside the ballrooms. For instance, I saw one man, he approached a group, he took a look at their lanyards and their badges, and he introduced himself. And it's these types of one-on-one sideline discussions that some say are just as valuable as the plenaries themselves.
Of course, we're waiting for the Philippine president to deliver his keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue.
If you're familiar with our TV news bulletins, you may be familiar with that voice. That's Su. She's a longtime presenter of the network, and events like these are her forte. She has been helming coverage from the Shangri-La Dialogue, and I want to talk to her now about her experience. Hi, Su.
Hello.
What do you feel like are the most important topics this year?
It's always US-China. When is it not? Come to that, every day in the news is US-China. The last 2 years, you're actually sitting in the thick of it. So you can see them walking up and down. You can see who doesn't like whom, who has the better uniform.
So what's the biggest difference for you being based in the studio versus being here on the ground?
It's much easier in studio, in a way because we have help from everyone else. Right? And when our colleagues bring guests in, they're more cowed because it's not their territory. But here it's neutral ground. The last 2 years where we're stationed to film, it's relatively isolated. But it depends on where IISS allows us to set up shop. When we're more towards the center of the hotel, very close to the lobby lounge. People you see on TV, ministers and people in uniform with all their hats on, sitting there drinking coffee, gossiping. The first time I saw that, I was... Yeah, and you notice some countries don't mix with others, like people in a playground.
Indonesia calls for justice.
I'm in the holding area just outside the ballroom where Indonesia's defense minister and President-elect Prabowo Subianto is speaking. It's a packed ballroom in there, and you need special accreditation to be inside. But those who don't have access, dozens of delegates, they're huddled around large and small TV screens. They have several 10-foot-tall monitors peppered throughout this venue so everyone can watch the addresses live. All right, there's a scrum happening here. A couple of dozen journalists surrounding this one gentleman. Let's try and get some audio.
So, sir, not a single square inch, not a single square millimeter. Would that be still accurate?
Yeah.
Do you know who this gentleman is?
He's the commander of the Philippine Coast Guard. Admiral Cavan.
I couldn't catch that. So what would you say again?
There's a lot of activity at an event like this, and sometimes you see scrums happening around people that you are unsure of. You just want to join the fray and hopefully get the soundbite that everyone else is getting. And that's what happened earlier. And here's an example of how media on the ground help each other. One of the things you notice about the Shangri-La Dialogue is how secure it feels. There are multiple checkpoints inside and out. The place is crawling with police and guards. With so many ministers and military heads in one place, security is critical. One of the delegates this year is also a leading Southeast Asian terrorism specialist and the dean of the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Dr. Kumar Ramakrishna joins me now. To be honest, I reached out to IISS to talk about the security measures. They didn't want to talk to me. Some measures are extremely visible, right? We can see the officers outside. We go through the checks. We see the scanners. What are some of the less conspicuous measures that have been taken that we can't see?
For understandable reasons, they wouldn't want to go and talk to the media about what the precise security measures are because everybody is watching and they don't want to give anything away, understandably. But from a general point of view, a place like this, as a hotel very near Orchard Road, as we all know, that's a pretty busy thoroughfare and many people come and go. But the security has got to be effective, but at the same time not overly onerous. So the trick is to strike a balance.
There's a joke among some people who say this could be the safest place or the most dangerous place to be in Singapore right now. What's your take?
I would say that this is a very safe place. This is the safest place right now.
Thank you very much, sir.
We will stick out with the rest of the media. When Zelenskyy comes to meet Austin, we film. Then after that, we film him coming out, and then we rush back to Island Ballroom, and then you are done for that.
A lot of time, journalists are hunting for newsmakers as well as monitoring the plenaries and the bilateral meetings. And there's a buzz in the air. You can feel people are excited to be here. And two of those people are my colleagues, Leong and Olivia Siong. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hi, Teresa. So good to be able to sit down for a little while.
So you've got your press badge, you've got multiple devices, your glasses, Kit. You are prepared for this summit. You've seen President Marcos Jr., Lloyd Austin, Volodymyr Zelenskyy live and in person. I have to ask you guys, do you get starstruck? What was the highlight for you?
Wow. For me, it would be Zelenskyy.
I live in China. We talk about the Ukraine war often as well with its relations with China and Russia and all that. But, seeing President Zelenskyy in the flesh, in person, right in front of me, getting out of the car, is different. You see someone who's so far away and with a war going on. I think it does add some extra weight to what we do.
I've been watching you work, Ollie. You've been tailing newsmakers, getting clips, getting in on those sessions, delivering live hits, and scouting for the best coffee, of course. What is key for you to covering such a complex event?
Actually, the coffee machine is a great place to hang out because during the sessions, that's also where a lot of the participants or media are gathered, in between the speeches that take place. And that's where a lot of conversations happen and exchanging of ideas and information. So it's not just for the coffee. Everyone needs the coffee. It's an early start every day. The sessions start at 8:30 a.m. local time. So it is pretty early.
I've seen the dynamic between you guys. You are a great team. Okay, so Kit, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. of the Philippines, he delivered the keynote address during the opening of the summit, and you were there. What did you make of his presence, of his message?
If you watch him and you put on mute, for instance, you wouldn't feel that he's saying something so important and some may describe fiery. But if you read between the lines, some of his statements can come across as another level of asserting Philippines' position. Before this, we were talking to so many observers, asking them, hey, what do you think his tone of speech will be? Whether you think he'll be not mincing his words, or whether you think it's nuanced. And we have got both sides of a school of thoughts. Most of them think that it will be more toned down because he's directly speaking to claimant states, especially China, who is in the room watching very closely. But then there are also others who say, hey, why not? Why shouldn't the Philippines take this opportunity to, make its position known? And of course, on that night, we heard that, the Philippines will not yield, what was the exact quote? I may be rephrasing, not a single inch or a single square milliliter. And then during the Q&A, he had also alluded to, if let's say a civilian were to die in the disputed waters, it is considered the red line being crossed. So that statement, that position came on very strongly.
Like it, U.S. Defense Chief Lloyd Austin, he's so hard to miss, right? He's a towering man.
Really tall.
He spoke about how the U.S. can only be secure if Asia is secure and that the Indo-Pacific is a priority for America. What was your sense of how delegates here received that message?
I think the delegates already know this message. I think all countries have come to the Shangri-La Dialogue with their own positions and narratives, which it's publicly known. The only difference is how they deliver it, how nuanced it is, or how intense it is. So the fact that he spoke at the Shangri-La Dialogue with this message to the world leaders, I feel that the delegates already know this. Both US and China say that the talks were positive. Let's take a listen to what the man, Lloyd Austin, had to say for himself.
So there is no substitute for direct military-to-military talks between senior leaders. And there's no substitute for open lines of communication to avoid misunderstanding and miscalculations. As I've always said, dialogue is not a reward. It's a necessity. And so I look forward to more talks with the PRC.
We heard from Lloyd Austin early on during this dialogue, and the very next day it was China's turn. Ollie, you listened in on Defense Minister Dong Jun's speech. What struck you?
I think there was a lot of anticipation for what was the Chinese defense minister's first appearance here at the Shangri-La Dialogue. After all, we know that Dong Jun only took up the post of defense minister just last year because he replaced the previous defense minister Li Shangfu, who was abruptly removed from his post. So the question was, what kind of tone China would take. I think one of the moments that stood out was when a Chinese delegate stood up to pose a question to the U.S. Defense Secretary after his speech, and he asked whether the U.S. was trying to create a NATO-like alliance in the Asia Pacific. And he then went on to say that it was NATO's eastward expansion that has caused the, quote, Ukraine crisis, to which the U.S. Defense Secretary then responded, saying that he respectfully disagreed with the Chinese delegate. And that drew a round of applause from quite many people in the ballroom. I was inside and observing who was clapping, and many of them were perhaps from the European countries, the Western countries. So that kind of showed the kind of tensions that have been in the spotlight. And we have seen throughout these few days that the Chinese have actually become a lot more vocal in voicing their position on various issues. For example, and this is more than previous years that we have covered before, for example, after the China and the US had those bilateral talks, they immediately, very soon after, called for a press briefing. After that same day, that night, in fact, after the Philippines president, Ferdinand Marcos, gave his speech where he took a tough stance, as Kit was saying, towards China, at 10:30 p.m., China held a press briefing. I can tell you that some of the journalists had actually left the venue and then came back to attend that briefing. And I think that perhaps is also recognition that they do want to get their narrative out there. They know that this is a big event where the headlines will be from whoever speaks. And if someone is giving a speech that they disagree with, they would also like to get their narrative out there. And I think that really speaks to the kind of geopolitics that's going on in the world today and this ongoing rivalry between China and the US. In particular, this was the response that the Lieutenant General Jing Jianfeng, who's the Deputy Chief of the Joint Staff Department at the Chinese Central Military Commission, had in response to the US Defense Secretary's speech. Have a listen.
Cobbling together small circles escalates regional tension. The US enhances military presence in the region and forces countries to take sides and advance eastward expansion of NATO. These moves are designed to tie regional countries to war chariots of US by spreading threats. This has become the source of risks.
Now, this event, it was pegged as a key opportunity for both the U.S. and China to improve their military-to-military relations. Lloyd Austin and Dong Jun, they met on the first day, Olivia, and they walked right past you. Tell us what it was like trying to find them.
Everything was very hush-hush. we started to get word from sources and contacts and media friends all working together and we kind of figured out the time that it was going to happen and the venue where this bilateral was going to happen at the Shangri-La Hotel. We took a walk before the meeting began, and actually, interestingly enough, this meeting venue just next to it is actually a splash park for children. And one of the staff there actually told me that they were going to be closing for these few days because of the Shangri-La Dialogue, and that is a sign of heightened security. And true enough, when we staked out there, and we did see the US Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, walking past the cameras. We tried to call out to him to ask what his expectations were for that meeting. He didn't answer. He kept a very stoic face and kept marching on to that meeting room with lots of security. Then we also saw the Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun then follow. We tried calling out in Chinese, what were his expectations again. Going into the meeting room, no words for us. But then coming out, it was interesting. We then heard Secretary Austin caught on camera saying, when people asked, he actually did say it went well. So it was a sign that, things seem to have gone well. And true enough, when we heard from the Chinese Defense Ministry spokesperson, he described it as a communication that was positive, practical, and constructive. And the US side issuing a statement emphasizing the importance of maintaining open lines of military-to-military communication between the two sides. So it did set the stage for what was to come. Both sides seemed keen on de-escalating tensions. You have to remember, this was the first time they were sitting down face-to-face for substantive talks in 18 months. They had cut off military dialogue after that controversial visit, which we spoke about, by then US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan. So this was very significant. But then if we looked a little bit deeper on the substantive issues like Taiwan, the South China Sea, Ukraine, it did seem both sides kind of doubled down on their positions. But it was interesting to see that both did seem to be keen to de-escalate. In fact, one of the things we noticed in the US Defense Secretary's speech was he never explicitly mentioned China in the entire speech. It was only at the Q&A that he did. Yeah.
I want to quickly jump in to the point Ollie made about shouting questions to these VIPs. And since this is a behind-the-scenes podcast, I want to also share with you why we do that. In fact, when Zelenskyy came, I also shouted a question to him. And yes, we know that he's 99% of the time not going to answer. But I've learned from veterans, back in 2016, when I was covering the ASEAN summit in Laos, that was when Obama also went. So we were all staking out, he was walking, and he was very quiet. And then someone said, "President Obama!" And he turned towards whoever was shouting it and smiled. And that's when all the cameras started clicking. And since then, I told myself, hey, that's a good tactic to get someone's attention. And even if it's just a smile, a nod, you can sense from their body language how things go. And since then, I've been asking. In fact, this time around, I asked Ollie, hey, how do I get Defense Minister Dong Jun's attention? What can I say? What should I shout? Pudang, Pudang. And then she told me, Pudang, Pudang. All right, you practice that so that you get attention of these VIPs.
Kit, you follow all things ASEAN for the network. You were keeping a close eye on issues that matter to that bloc, and you attended a special session on Myanmar. You made a very interesting observation there, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, the moment I stepped in, I saw two uniformed Chinese military officials. And I'm like, oh, this is a first. I mean, since the coup, I've been keeping a close watch on all things Myanmar, including Shangri-La Dialogues. And this is the first time that I noticed uniformed officers in the midst of a Myanmar session. So, of course, I strolled up to them and said, oh, why is China so interested this time round? And they said, oh, as Myanmar's neighbors, we have to be concerned about what's going on in Myanmar. And I left it at that because the session started. During the session, one Thai delegate raised a question, and that question had China in it. The participant said, and I'm rephrasing here, that, oh, nobody talks about the efforts of China. China was the only country that was able to make a concrete positive outcome because China had facilitated truce when there was fighting that started last October.
You talk about access, right? Access to places many people don't get a chance to see. And Olivia, you were able to nab a coveted delegate's pass. I don't have one of those. You got to see things that I was not privy to. And I'm wondering, what was the most interesting thing that you observed?
I think one of the things that was great having the access to was the ballroom and being able to be inside for the keynote address, the plenary sessions, and to observe what was happening. I kind of felt like a fly on the wall during the opening dinner. So, seating arrangements for these dinners are, I would say, both a science and an art. There were the VIP tables at the front of the ballroom. I was seated way back. But, before the event begins, you are free to move and walk around and talk to people who are around. And so I wanted to have a look at the seating arrangements. And what was interesting was that the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was seated at the same table as the Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, who was giving the keynote speech that night. But seated at a different table next door was the Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun. So they were seated at different tables. You probably can guess why organizers might do that. And then you had the Singapore leaders hosting fanned out at different tables with all the different delegates, because this year Shangri-La Dialogue saw 3 presidents attending, 1 president-elect, and I believe it was over 40 ministerial level delegates, and it's really high level, and I guess it does show the importance of Asia when it comes to security issues and the kind of attention that the world places on it. Another interesting thing that I got to observe was the reactions. One thing I was looking out for, because I cover China, and when the US Defense Secretary was speaking, I was looking out for how the Chinese were going to react. And so I saw that at the end of Secretary Austin's speech, some of the Chinese delegates would kind of put their heads together and huddle and discuss or talk or speak to each other. You wonder, I wasn't close enough to hear what they were saying, but you wonder what they were saying to each other.
Okay, I'm going to play a clip now of you, Wykit, asking Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy the first question at the press conference that he held. Take a listen.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. China has said it's not attending the peace conference in Switzerland, although it has voiced out that China and Brazil will be holding one. Would you be open to sitting in for this conference with Russia?
Okay, so there were rumblings that he would attend. It was only confirmed very late. All 3 of us were actually in that room for that media conference, and you sat right in the front and center, Wykit. What did you take away from that exchange with Mr. Zelenskyy?
My first thought, and I say this not in the capacity of a journalist, my genuine first thought was, how tired must this man be? How heavy your shoulders are to go around the world garnering support for your cause. And my thought was, how tired must this man be? And then as a journalist, I looked at him and I thought, this man is really media savvy. He answers every question with nothing to hide. He tells you whatever he knows. But he always draws the attention back to Ukrainian civilians, to children, to women. And this is one person who is so media savvy that he's going around the world, fielding questions, going around the world, answering questions to the point, but then never forgetting to get the attention back on the Ukrainian civilians whom he feels responsible for. You can also imagine, and you were there, Teresa, along with Ollie, many of these questions center around China. And he answered them. Let's take a listen to some of what he said.
Russia, using Chinese influence on the region, using Chinese diplomats also, does everything to disrupt peace summit. Regrettably, it is unfortunate that such big, independent, powerful country as China is an instrument in hands of Putin.
Actually, one of the interesting things that happened as well was I had the opportunity to speak with the IISS Executive Chairman, Sir John Chipman, who was instrumental in bringing the Ukrainian President to the Shangri-La Dialogue. I asked him why and how did it happen. He said the Ukrainian president himself wanted to be here in person, and he wanted to reach out to get support for this upcoming peace conference that's going to take place in Switzerland. I asked him, did it take convincing to get him here? And he said no, it didn't. He wanted to be here even though what's happening in Ukraine right now is difficult. So that was an interesting moment, I think.
At the end of the day, do you think these types of dialogues get us anywhere? Is it just a bunch of officials in suits and uniforms talking? Or do you think real progress will be made once they leave these hotel walls?
I think what is real is the follow-up work. I think each delegation goes back with renewed agenda to follow up on, and they would, in fact, from the series of meetings they had, reach out to whomever they need to reach out to get work done. So the follow-up is real. The progress, and I think in that sense, because there is will to continue the work and discussion and to do something on a different level, I think that is heartening.
Well, I think sometimes at the end of the day, we are so focused on this particular event. It's so intense for these few days and all the headlines that come out. But we also have to remember that this is just one event in the world of events that's taking place. There's so many talks that go on and diplomatic channels, back channels. There's a lot of talking. And I think one of the things that talking to delegates who have been present, observers, what they do say is that it's better to talk than not at all. Progress, like Waikit said, it depends on who you ask. But I guess if people are talking, then at least there's some hope maybe that this will be this is going to sound very cliche, but at least a better, safer place, right?
Yeah, I agree.
It's been exhausting. It's also been exhilarating. Great to have you guys here at the Dialogue. And thank you so much for your insights, Waikit and Olivia.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you.
We are back to usual programming from our podcast studio next week. But until then, a reminder that the TV episodes of CNA Correspondent air every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. And find all our correspondents' reports anytime on YouTube and CNA.Asia. The team behind this week's episode is Saya Win, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, and Craig Dale. I'm Teresa Tang. Bye for now.